The Russian and US ambassadors to the UN engaged in a fresh battle of words at a meeting of the Security Council. Washington's envoy came out swinging against Moscow over violations of the peace deal in Ukraine, despite the truce largely holding.
2 days ago, Russia sent its 17th so-called humanitarian convoy into Ukraine, once again denying international observers and Ukrainian border guards the right to conduct a full and complete inspection of its contents.
The last convoy, as well as previous ones, have been thoroughly checked by Ukrainian customs and border control officers at the Donetsk checkpoint. US Ambassador Power, I'd like to ask you to find out what the American embassies are doing in Moscow and Kiev and why they continue to provide you with cheap disinformation instead of these simple facts.
A heated conversation at the Security Council in New York there, and across the Atlantic, the UK has warned that it's ready to bring sanctions against Russia to a whole different level. However, despite the UK's hawkish approach, the EU is not considering further restrictions at the moment. EU foreign ministers are debating their policy on Ukraine at an informal summit in Latvia. RT's Gayane Chichakyan looks at the differences between the allies in the US and Europe.
The UK and the US threaten more sanctions against Russia if the Minsk peace agreement fails.
We have already begun this week intensive consultations with our European partners on further sanctions pressure.
The UK's David Cameron said the West must be prepared to, quote, settle in for a long and determined position against Russia. The UK is preparing to send instructors to train Ukrainian troops. The US has already done that. President Obama has not decided to send weapons, but U.S. lawmakers left and right are pushing for it. They're pushing for it now, when violence in Ukraine has finally subsided and everyone agrees that the peace deal is working.
I think the strongest thing that we can do now is to provide Kyiv with defensive lethal weapons.
And such lethal aid would have an effect on the battlefield, but also a political effect.
In the meantime, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece are speaking with a different voice. They say this is not the time to send weapons to Ukraine and that new sanctions against Russia is not what they're focused on. Germany says they're trying to make the peace deal work. That is the issue in the foreground and not the question if there will be new sanctions. France says it's for de-escalation of the conflict and against sending military instructors and weapons to Ukraine. High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs has slammed the suggestions made by the U.S. to send weapons to arm the Ukrainian military. I'm joined by Brian Becker from the Answer Coalition. In your view, is this a good cop, bad cop tactic between the U.S. and the U.K. on the one side and these other European powers on the other? Or do you think there is a real difference in strategy and objectives in Ukraine?
I think we're seeing a real divergence, not just a good cop, bad cop scenario being played out against Russia. There's a divergence of interest because the United States is trying to impose new economic sanctions that hurt not only Russia, but also its European trading partners. The United States is far away and can, watch others fight, can have a good political outcome, they hope, but they're not really suffering. So, of course, the European countries are having experienced World War I, having experienced World War II, very, very worried, rightfully so, about the beginning of a regional conflict or a local conflict developing into a continent-wide or even a global conflict because the Europeans have experienced it, they've suffered it. It's easy for American politicians to talk about war and to be tough and new sanctions and send weapons. For the European powers, they know where that road leads.
Thank you, sir. Brian Becker with me in Washington. I'm Gayane Chichakyan, RT.